picture the inner chambers of ancient Egypt. I mean, really try to put yourself right there in the room. You are standing in the nerve center of the most powerful empire on the planet, and the air in this room is just heavy, you know.
Oh, absolutely. It's thick with that specific kind of tension you only get when you're in the presence of absolute, unquestioned authority, like you are surrounded by Pharaoh's cabinet.
Right, the ultimate inner circle. We're talking military generals, chief propagandists, top economic advisors, and Pharaoh, the guy who literally holds the life and death of every person in the empire in his hands, is pacing the floor.
And he is furious. I mean, he's actively declaring his intent to execute a revolutionary named Moses. He says, right in front of everyone, let me kill him. Let him call upon his God. I want to see this.
Which is just, it's a terrifying high-stakes political standoff. He's mocking him, sure, but there is real violent intent there. And the reason we are starting this deep dive in this room at this exact moment is because of a radical interpretation by a 20th century Quranic scholar.
Yes, Allama Parwez. And Parwez completely shatters the way we usually read this narrative. Like, he makes this incredibly striking argument right off the bat.
Yeah, he says this scene you just pictured, this was never a religious dispute.
Exactly. It was never a theological debate or some fight over the right to pray in a certain way. Parwez argues that the source text is actually presenting a structural blueprint of how absolute power operates.
And how monopolies are justified and how they are ultimately dismantled. So today, our mission for this deep dive is to completely deconstruct the way you view absolute power.
Right. We are pulling from Parwez's extensive lectures on Surah, specifically verses 28 and 29. And we want to show you how these ancient texts are actually operating as highly sophisticated, modern socioeconomic blueprints.
Because if you're listening to this, you might be thinking, well, I don't live in an ancient empire. Why does this matter?
But Parwez is basically asking you to look at the power dynamics in your own world. Because usually when we hear the story of Moses and Pharaoh, we just default to thinking of it as a purely religious clash, right?
Yeah, exactly. The prophet versus the pagan king. The classic Sunday school version. But Parwez says, no, look at the actual forces arrayed against Moses. He isn't just a preacher on a soapbox trying to save souls.
Far from it. He is taking on a massive, impenetrable triad of societal oppression, and that triad is really the absolute foundation of Parwez's structural analysis here.
Right, so let's break that triad down, because Parwez identifies three distinct pillars operating in this society. First, you have state tyranny, which is the monopoly on violence.
And that's embodied by Pharaoh himself, of course. Then you have the capitalist monopoly over the resources and the means of production, which is represented in the text by the figure of Qarun.
And finally, you have the manipulation of the masses by the religious and media elite, represented by Haman. So it's state, wealth, and ideology.
Exactly. But
wait, let me just push back on that last piece right out of the gate, because I think it's important. I understand Pharaoh is the state, right?
Yeah.
And I get Qarun hoarding the wealth.
Sure, those are pretty straightforward.
But how exactly does Haman, like the ideology, the religious elite, fit into this as a structural economic pillar? Because it's easy to just say, oh, manipulation of the masses.
Right. It sounds a bit abstract.
Yeah, so what is the actual mechanism there? How does ideology protect capital in this specific framework?
Okay, that is the crucial question. Because without Haman, the other two pillars completely collapse. Think about it. Raw state violence is incredibly expensive.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And highly unstable to maintain long-term.
Exactly. You cannot hold a society of enslaved laborers like the Bani Israel in this text purely at sword point forever. Mathematically, they will eventually outnumber and overthrow you.
Right. You can't just post a guard at every single person's door. It doesn't scale.
It doesn't scale at all. So you need a mechanism to manufacture consent, and that is Haman's role. His job is to create a narrative that makes the economic extractions seem like the natural divine order of the universe.
Oh, wow. So the religious elite basically tell the underclass that their suffering is just, what, the will of the gods?
Yes, exactly. They preach that to rebel against Qarun's economic monopoly, or Pharaoh's state violence, is to literally rebel against the cosmos itself. Haman is the software that runs the hardware of the empire.
The software that runs the hardware. I love that. That makes a lot of sense. So Haman neutralizes the rebellion before it even starts in people's minds.
He makes the chains invisible.
He makes the chains invisible. And honestly, that's what makes Moses walking into this cabinet room so incredibly audacious.
Completely. I mean, you have a single individual representing an enslaved, marginalized, heavily policed underclass.
And he just walks right into the center of this impregnable triad of power. He doesn't have an army backing him up. He doesn't have billions in gold.
No, he just has a rational, structural critique of their entire society.
And his critique is so sharp and so fundamentally devastating to that feedback loop of Pharaoh, Korun, and Haman that the ultimate dictator is literally losing his composure.
Right, which brings us back to that opening scene. Pharaoh is so rattled that he's asking his cabinet for implicit approval to cross the line into naked extrajudicial assassination.
Because he can't win the argument. And that desperation from Pharaoh, that sudden lurch toward raw violence, is the catalyst for one of the most fascinating psychological breakdowns in the text.
It really is. Because right in the middle of this cabinet meeting, a single member of Pharaoh's own elite inner circle stands up, and the text refers to him as the believing man.
And this is where Parwez forces us to totally rethink the psychology of the elite, because the traditional interpretation of this believing man is that he was, like, a secret convert.
Right, the standard view is that he was someone who had been quietly praying to Moses' God in the dark, hiding his faith out of fear, just waiting for the right moment to out himself.
But Parwez takes a total sledgehammer to that idea. He argues this wasn't religious hypocrisy at all, and it wasn't some ancient undercover spy operation.
Yeah, Parwez says it was a manifestation of pure, unadulterated elite cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance. Okay, unpack that for us,
Yeah.
because that's a big shift from the secret believer narrative.
Well, to understand this, we have to look at the Arabic term Parwez uses to describe the psychological state of Pharaoh's cabinet. The word is anania.
Dananiyat.
Yeah, and the root of the word is anai, which simply means I. But ananiyat is much, much deeper than simple arrogance or vanity.
It's more structural than that.
Exactly. It is the inflation of the ego to the point where it becomes the absolute boundary of reality itself. It is a deeply ingrained structural sense of class superiority.
Okay, let me test a metaphor here just to make sure I'm tracking. Because I think a lot of people imagine cognitive dissonance like, well, a modern corporate boardroom, right?
Sure, yeah.
Where the executives secretly know their product is toxic, maybe it's polluting a river or whatever, but they stay quiet for the bonus checks. They know they're bad guys.
Right, the classic greedy executive trope.
But Ananiat sounds heavier than just greed. It sounds more like the load-bearing walls in a skyscraper, like it's structural to their very identity.
That is a much more accurate way to look at it, yes.
Because if these cabinet members admit that Moses' structural critique of their economy is correct, they aren't just losing a policy debate.
No, they have to pull the pin on their own foundational identity.
Exactly. Their entire sense of self, their elite education, their culture, their refinement, all of it is literally built on the surplus value extracted from the enslaved Bani Israel.
Yep. To admit Moses is right is to admit that their entire existence is basically a parasite on human suffering.
Wow. So their ego acts as a load-bearing wall to keep their psychological skyscraper from collapsing.
Exactly, because intellectually, Parwez argues, these cabinet members actually knew Moses was right. They weren't stupid, they were highly educated administrators.
They could see the spreadsheets, so to speak.
Right. They had heard Moses' socio-economic arguments, and their rational minds were satisfied. They could look at the data of their society and see the friction, the inherent unsustainability of it.
But their Ananiat blocked them from conceding it out loud.
Yes. They simply couldn't stomach the idea that an underclass, the people they viewed as unwashed laborers, possessed the correct vision for human society. I mean, the ego will protect the status quo at almost any cost.
That is wild. So what breaks that load-bearing wall then? If the ego is that entrenched and the class conditioning is that powerful, how do you go from sitting quietly in the cabinet enjoying the perks of the empire to suddenly standing up and speaking truth to absolute power?
Right. What flips the switch for the believing man in that specific moment?
Yeah, what happened to him right then?
The mechanism that shatters the Ananiat is the shock of imminent, unjustified state violence.
The moment Pharaoh says, "Let me kill him."
Exactly. Up until Pharaoh said that, the cabinet could maintain their cognitive dissonance because the empire operated under this veneer of law, order, and bureaucratic sophistication.
They could debate Moses, they could stall, they could play political theater, set up committees, whatever.
Right, they could pretend they were a civilized society having a rigorous debate. But when the system could no longer defend itself intellectually...
And Pharaoh just casually decides to resort to an extrajudicial murder to protect his monopoly.
The mask slipped.
The system lurched into naked brutality.
It did. And for the believing man, the sheer illegitimate violence of executing a man merely for speaking a structural truth, that was the mathematical breaking point.
The cognitive dissonance just couldn't hold that weight anymore.
It couldn't, because the elite pride themselves on being rational, civilized actors. When the state resorts to outright thuggery, it exposes its own illegitimacy.
So the believing man realized that if he stayed silent while the state murdered an innocent man just to protect his profit margins,
He was no longer a sophisticated administrator. He was just an accomplice to a cartel.
man, that transition is massive. So if the system's sudden pivot to violence alienated its own top cabinet members, we have to ask the next logical question.
Which is,
What was the fatal flaw in Pharaoh's underlying logic that Moses was exploiting in the first place? What exactly was Moses saying that made Pharaoh so homicidal that he broke his own rules of engagement?
and that brings us right to the core of Moses' message, which revolves around a deeply misunderstood phrase in the text, Rabbi Allah.
Rabbi Allah, meaning my Rab is Allah.
Yes, and this is perhaps the most crucial redefinition Parwaz offers in his entire commentary, because traditionally, Rabbi Allah is translated simply as, my Lord is God.
Right, and the traditional passive interpretation of history suggests that Pharaoh was angry because Moses was introducing a new theology, like a new unseen deity into the Egyptian pantheon.
Exactly, a religious turf war. But Parwaz is completely adamant here. Pharaoh was not threatening to kill Moses over daily prayers.
Because if Moses just wanted to take his people into a corner and quietly pray to an unseen god, Pharaoh wouldn't have cared.
Not at all. Empires do not care what you do in your private temple as long as you pay your taxes and show up to the labor camp on Monday morning.
That's such a good point. Parwaz basically argues that the very idea of religion as this passive, personal set of rituals is a modern invention.
A modern invention specifically designed to declaw structural critiques.
Yes. So to grasp why Pharaoh reacted with murderous intent, we have to really dig into the etymology of that word Rab.
Right, let's do a deep dive into Rab. Because in ancient Arabic, Rab does not merely mean a spiritual deity you worship from afar.
What does it mean then, structurally?
The root letters denote the process of nourishing something, sustaining it, and taking it from its most basic state to its highest point of perfection.
Okay, so it's a very active, tangible process.
It is fundamentally an active, resource-dependent concept. It literally means the sustainer, the provider of the actual means of survival.
Okay, I want to stop you right there, because this is where the historical friction really happens for a lot of people. You're saying Rab is a deeply economic, structural concept,
Yes, absolutely.
but traditional history is just completely obsessed with the Egyptian pantheon. I mean, we have museums full of Ra and Osiris and Anubis.
Right, the whole mythology.
So if Pharaoh's power was fundamentally an economic monopoly, why the elaborate mythology? How does Parwaz reconcile this structural economic claim against thousands of years of established historical theology?
Well, it all comes back to the role of Haman that we discussed earlier. The elaborate mythology wasn't separate from the economy. The mythology was the economic system.
Oh, interesting. How so?
In ancient Egypt, the temples weren't just places of spiritual reflection. They were literally the central banks of the empire.
Wow. Okay, that shifts the whole perspective.
Right. They collected the grain, they controlled the land, they distributed the rations. The high priests were effectively the treasury secretaries.
So when Pharaoh stood up before Egypt and claimed, as the Quran quotes him, I am your highest Rab,
He wasn't primarily making a theological claim about his soul or his divine essence. He was making a brutal, highly practical economic claim.
he was literally saying, I am the central bank.
Precisely. He was stating, I own the Nile. I own the granaries. I own the means of production. I am the ultimate source of your economic survival.
So he was claiming an absolute monopoly over the resources of the earth, but he was just using the theological language of the pantheon as his legal justification.
Exactly. It was property law disguised as religion.
So when Moses walks into the court and declares, Rabbi Allah, my Rab, is a law, it is not some quiet declaration of personal faith.
No, not at all. He isn't saying, my invisible God is stronger than your stone gods.
He is committing an act of high treason against the economic supply chain.
Yes. By saying the sustainer, the nourisher, is the universal divine, Moses is explicitly stating that no human being has the right to monopolize the resources of the earth.
Man, it is a complete structural manifesto.
It really is. Moses is saying the rivers, the land, the harvest, these are a universal trust meant for the nourishment of all humanity.
They don't belong in the private treasury of a single dictator.
Exactly. Rabbi law means the economic subjugation of one human by another is inherently illegitimate. It means Pharaoh's entire system of wealth extraction is a crime against the universal objective order.
Moses was threatening the empire's profit margins, not its temples. And if you're listening to this right now, I mean, think about the supply chains that deliver goods to your front door today.
Right. Apply the blueprint.
Parwes is basically asking you to look at who is claiming the role of the highest sustainer in your own economic ecosystem, who controls the access to nourishment, to housing, to survival in our world.
And then look at how those power structures react when their monopoly is threatened. Because Pharaoh, being an absolute master manipulator, realizes he is completely cornered here.
Yeah, Moses has totally trapped him with a rational socioeconomic critique.
And Pharaoh can't logically defend his monopoly. He can't stand in front of his cabinet and say, actually, it is mathematically good that I hoard all the food while the B'nai Israel starve to death building my monuments.
Because the math doesn't work.
Right, the math is indefensible. So what does a tyrant do when he can't win the structural argument?
He pivots. He completely changes the subject. And the tactic Pharaoh uses here is so cynically brilliant, it feels like it was ripped straight out of a 21st century spin room.
Oh, it's so modern.
Right. Pharaoh looks at Moses, ignores the economic critique entirely, and asks, well, what about our ancestors? Are they in hell?
It is a textbook political maneuver.
It's insane.
When an unjust power structure faces a legitimate threat to its economic monopoly, it almost never engages on the actual issues of wealth distribution or labor rights or justice.
Never.
Instead, it manufactures a wedge issue. It distracts the public with emotional, cultural, or theological outrage.
It's the ultimate culture war. Moses is standing there saying, hey, let's talk about the forced labor camps. Let's talk about how the wealth of this nation is being hoarded by a fraction of a percent of the population.
And Pharaoh grabs a microphone and says, hey, everyone, Moses is insulting your great-grandfather. Moses says your beloved ancestors are burning in hell.
Because Pharaoh knows exactly how to trigger the emotional defense mechanisms of the masses.
Exactly. If he can get Moses to take the bait and start debating the theological status of dead ancestors, the debate is no longer about Pharaoh's tyranny.
It becomes a visceral, emotional conflict between Moses and the people's heritage.
And the masses will turn on Moses out of sheer cultural pride, totally ignoring the fact that Moses is the only person in the room actively fighting for their economic liberation.
You see this exact mechanism play out in modern politics constantly. I mean, think about it. Whenever there is a real unified push by a working class to examine structural inequality,
suddenly the headlines are flooded with debates about flags.
Flags or historical statues or some massive outrage about a celebrity's tweet. The powerful use these cultural wedge issues to divide the public.
So they spend their energy fighting each other instead of uniting to, audit the bank accounts of the elite.
Exactly. Which brings us to a really critical juncture in Parwes's analysis. Because it is one thing to critique a corrupt system and see through the tyrant's distractions, right? But it is another entirely to offer a viable replacement. How does Moses actually respond to this trap, and what positive model does he offer?
Because the danger of many revolutions throughout history is that they are purely reactionary.
Yeah, history is absolutely littered with revolutions that successfully storm the palace, overthrew a tyrant, only to install a new tyrant the very next morning.
Right, the oppressed become the oppressors.
Guillotine just changes hands. But the actual structure of absolute power remains completely intact. They just swap out the guy sitting in the big chair.
And Pharaoh actually tries to pin this exact motive on Moses to discredit him in front of the cabinet.
Oh, he does. How so?
Yes. Pharaoh accuses Moses of possessing kibria. And this is another vital term we need to unpack.
Kibria. What does that mean in this context?
Kibria translates to a desire for greatness, supremacy, and political dominance over the land. So Pharaoh says to his cabinet, you don't care about the people, Moses. You just want my throne. This is just a political power grab.
Projecting his own motives onto Moses. But Parwes points out that Moses' response completely disarms this accusation. Moses doesn't fall into the trap of seeking a power transfer. He demands a total paradigm shift.
Right. Moses tells Pharaoh, effectively, I don't want your throne. I have no interest in ruling Egypt. I don't want to become the new dictator.
His stated goal is simply to remove the enslaved workforce from the subjugation of human beings altogether.
Liberation, not replacement.
Yes, liberation, not replacement.
Moses isn't saying, make me the new Pharaoh
Mhm.
so I can rule the Bani Israel more benevolently than you did. He is arguing that the very architecture of a society where one human being has absolute authority over another is fundamentally flawed.
So what does the alternative actually look like then? If we were throwing out the entire concept of human subjugation, what is the structure of Parwiz's universal objective law?
Because it's easy to say divine system, but that can sound like abstract theology again, right?
Exactly. What are the concrete mechanics of the society Moses is actually proposing here?
Well, a society governed by universal objective law means that the rules of socioeconomic justice apply equally to everyone, completely independent of human whim.
Because in Pharaoh's system, the law was entirely subjective.
Exactly. If Pharaoh was angry that morning, people died. If he was feeling generous, cronies got rewarded. The economy was dictated by the fragile ego of the ruler.
But Moses proposes a structure where the laws of sustenance, the distribution of resources, are treated like the laws of physics.
Yes. They are permanent, rational principles. No human being, not a king, not a billionaire, and crucially, in Parwiz's analysis, not even a prophet, has the right to demand absolute servitude or obedience from another human being.
Wow. Not even a prophet.
Right. A prophet simply delivers the objective law. He does not become the new Pharaoh.
It is the total structural eradication of the master-slave dynamic. Moses is essentially saying to the cabinet, I am not offering you a new boss. I am offering the end of bosses.
And you can imagine how that lands in a room full of people whose entire identity is based on being the bosses.
Right. But the believing man, who has already broken through his cognitive dissonance, sees the pure rationality of this. And he uses this exact logic to defend Moses to his colleagues.
He does. He says, look at what he's actually asking for. He's not raising an army to take over the palace. He just wants to take his people out of this abusive economic system.
The believing man recognizes that Moses' alternative is structurally sound. It doesn't rely on the unstable foundation of human ego.
And this realization leads to the absolute climax of the narrative. The believing man turns to the cabinet and delivers what Parwiz considers a masterclass in rational synthesis.
He doesn't beg Pharaoh for mercy, does he?
No, he doesn't appeal to their emotions or their pity for the enslaved. He gives them a cold, hard, logical proof regarding the inevitability of systemic collapse.
Yes. Let's examine this final argument because it really ties everything together. The believing man lays out a binary outcome for them.
Right. He tells the most powerful people in the world there are only two possibilities here. Either Moses is a liar or he is telling the truth.
Okay, let's look at the first option.
If he is lying, the believing man argues. If his socioeconomic model is flawed, if he is just making up this concept of an objective universal law, then he will fail on his own.
Because a society or a movement built on falsehood contradicts the natural laws of human survival.
Exactly. The natural consequences of his flawed model will destroy his movement from the inside out. Therefore, the state doesn't need to murder him. The system will self-correct.
So he's saying, leave him alone. If he's wrong, reality will crush him anyway.
Right. But
This is where he drives the dagger into the heart of the empire's logic.
if he is right, if his structural critique of our society is accurate, then killing him will not save you.
Boom. That is profound.
Because if Moses is right, it means the Egyptian empire is fundamentally built on exploitation, tyranny, and an unsustainable monopoly of resources.
And a system built on those foundations is structurally doomed. It violates the universal laws of socioeconomic balance.
The collapse isn't magic. It is mathematical inevitability.
He is looking at the ultimate dictator and saying, your power is an illusion. You can execute the messenger, you can assassinate the revolutionary, but you cannot execute the structural reality of the universe.
Absolutely. If you operate an economy that consumes its own working class, your empire will crumble from the inside out, no matter how much violence you use to try and hold it together.
The truth of Moses' message isn't dependent on Moses being alive. It's baked into the physics of human history. Unchecked tyranny always collapses.
And the immediate aftermath of this purely rational argument is just profound. The text reveals a massive crack in the facade of absolute power.
Because Pharaoh, the God King, the man who just moments ago was furiously demanding the extrajudicial execution of Moses, he suddenly gets incredibly defensive.
After the believing man speaks, Pharaoh literally backpedals in front of his own cabinet.
He goes from, I am your highest lord, I own the rivers, let me kill him, to saying, well, I am only advising you on what I see. I am only guiding you to the right path.
He turns into a middle manager.
He really does. He's suddenly trying to justify his quarterly report. Hey guys, I'm just giving my opinion here. I'm just trying to help.
It is a stunning shift in tone.
A single, rational voice of truth, speaking clearly about the socioeconomic reality of their system, managed to completely fracture the ultimate dictator's confidence.
And it perfectly proves Parwa's structural thesis. Absolute power is actually incredibly fragile. It's a skyscraper built on a foundation of intellectual insecurity.
It relies entirely on silence, doesn't it?
Yes. On silence, on compliance, on the anonymity of the elite, and the manufactured consent of the masses.
But the moment someone breaks that silence with a rational, undeniable critique of the underlying mechanism, the tyrant is forced to justify themselves.
And the moment absolute power has to justify itself, it is no longer absolute. That is the first step toward its inevitable downfall.
This is such an empowering way to read history. It takes these ancient texts out of the dusty realm of myth and, abstract theological debate and turns them into living, breathing manuals for understanding the geometry of power today.
It really does. It shows you that systems of monopoly, no matter how entrenched or wealthy they seem, are not invincible. They are, in fact, terrified of structural truth.
Which leaves you, the listener, with a really vital question to consider as you navigate your own reality. I mean, we've mapped out how the triad of state, capital, and ideology operates.
We've seen how leaders use cultural wedge issues to distract you from economic monopolies, and how cognitive dissonance protects the status quo.
So when you look at the political and economic systems operating around you today, when you scroll through your news feeds, when you listen to the debates, when you look at your own supply chains, are you actively engaging with the structural reality of who controls the resources and human labor?
Or are you still, thousands of years later, allowing the powerful to distract you with endless engineered debates over whose ancestors are in hell?